All right, well, welcome back. I realized earlier I didn't introduce myself. I just assume everybody knows who I am.
Wait, we raise our hand if we don't. There can't be anyone who doesn't.
Is there anyone that doesn't know who I am? I am Elaine Cochran. I'm the Deputy Superintendent for Finance and Operations. And also assisting me today will be Gina Mitschke, our CFO. If you were here the last time we did Taxpayer Tuesday at Dripping Springs Elementary, I let Gina take the show, and she did School Finance 101. So a lot of this material is a repeat. You can't really talk about school finance without talking about recapture. You can't talk about recapture without talking about school finance. So, disclaimer, I cannot make this stuff up. So as I try to talk you through recapture, you're gonna say, this is the craziest thing I've ever heard. I did not make it up. I just am living with it and trying to understand it and teach others about it. So with that, we'll get started. We're here today, January 14, 2025. That seems so weird to say.
So weird.
Next meeting is February 11th. We'll be back at our offices, the Center for Learning and Leadership, and talking about legislative advocacy. So I believe today the legislature is starting again for the 25 session. What is it, 89? So we'll be diving into that. And then in April, our last one this year will be at Rooster, where we're going to be talking about bonds. So if you haven't heard, the board is in the middle of putting together a bond package for a May election. And so we are knee-deep into bond planning, and by April we'll know what is in that, and we'll have done those presentations 1,000 times. So our goal today is to educate you on the system of recapture in Texas. It is crazy. When you understand it at a high level, you understand why it's put in place. Doesn't mean it's our favorite thing, but there is a purpose for it. We're going to look at ways to reduce excess revenues. Who wants to reduce excess revenues? Not me, but that's the wording that the state has given us. Very important. Why increased property tax bills do not increase the school district's revenue? That's where recapture comes into play. Provide detail on our funding from the basic allotment and weighted population. So we talk about this a lot when we talk about school finance and recapture, but we've never really looked at the numbers. So we're going to get into that, and then the spending requirements on those weighted populations. I thought as we try to make these fresh, because we've done this a few times, right? So what new information can we bring that we haven't talked about before? And I thought it would be important to really just look at our overall revenues first before we dive into them. So this was from our budget adoption for the current school year. You can see, and this is before recapture, but where do the majority of our revenues come from? Property taxes. So that's the big piece of the pie. We have this small little sliver here for state funding, and I'm going to tell you the majority of that is TRS. And so the teacher retirement system that we all pay into for employees of the district, we take some out of every employee's check, and then the state matches that. And that's an accounting entry, but it shows up as a revenue and an offsetting expenditure. So our state funding at 10%, what we can really spend is really not that large, but what we're going to focus on today is this big piece of the Pac-Man, local tax collections. And I'll note, we don't get to keep all of this. This is where recapture comes in. All right, so what is recapture? I always like to go straight to the dictionary. What does this even mean? So recapture, the act of retaking of a prize or goods under international law, or I love this one, a government seizure under law of earnings beyond a fixed amount. That's exactly what recapture is. It's the state coming in and saying, you have too many taxes from local tax collections, and we want to take some of that back so that you're on the same playing field as all the other school districts in Texas. So, very good definition of recapture. When we look at recapture across Texas, And I haven't studied other state school funding mechanisms. I don't know that anyone else has recapture per se, but this is our process, which some districts, not all districts, send our tax revenues back to the state. It's been called Chapter 41, and so we've been doing this for 29 years. That's what I grew up with, so you'll hear me slip. Oh, we're Chapter 41. It's really now Chapter 49. You've heard it called Robin Hood, stealing from the rich to give to the poor. That's not exactly what's happening. And excess wealth. Excess wealth meaning you had higher property values than a neighboring district, so your excess wealth. House Bill 3 in 2019 revised it, moved Chapter 41 to Chapter 49 because it wasn't confusing enough. We're going to make you learn a new number. And so your Tier 1 local share, if it exceeds your entitlement, that becomes recapture. And so again, what is the intent of this? So I like to give this demonstration, and it's a real world demonstration. If you follow what's happening in our area, you've got Tesla in Del Valley. You've got Samsung in Maynard and Taylor. So those districts are seeing huge value increases in their property values. If there weren't a thing called recapture, now all of a sudden they would have all this tax revenue and they could pay their teachers $100,000. How could I compete with that? I can't. And so if a plant were to come into Johnson City, some industry, and all of a sudden they have a bigger tax base, they can build big fancy schools, pay their teachers more, buy air-conditioned buses, all the things, and we would be right next door going, well, we want an industry, but we don't have one. And so that's why recapture is in place. It's trying to make sure that at some level, all school districts in Texas have the same level of funding. What happens is values grow, recapture grows, and you're going to see on a chart, it gets so big that the state comes in and changes the law and changes the formulas, reduces recapture, and then it gets out of whack again, and they'll come in and change the law. And so I have some very good illustrations of where that happens. So there are 5 options to reduce your excess revenue, and that's what the state calls it. I don't feel like I have excess revenue. I could do so much with all the revenue that I'm sending back, but under law, you have 5 ways to get in compliance. So the first one is a consolidation agreement. This is literally consolidating with another school district. That is a mess. Nobody wants to do that. You can detach and annex. So you could say, okay, well, I'm Houston ISD and I have this Galleria and it's got a lot of property value. I'll just give that value to a Leaf or another school district so I don't collect the taxes on that property. That's messy. But the state will force you to do that if you don't do it the easy way. So purchase of attendance credits. Basically, you're giving back your tax dollars, but it's through a mechanism called purchasing attendance credits. So it's really giving the state money and they're increasing your ADA so that you no longer have excess wealth. Well, I don't have additional ADA that I'm trying to teach or account for. So ADA is average daily attendance. Why is it called purchase of attendance credits? That's the way it's written in the law. This is what virtually all Chapter 49 school districts do. They just fill out all the paperwork that's necessary with TEA and you send them a check. You can educate non-residents from another. This again requires voter approval and an agreement between 2 partner districts. I don't know anyone that does this. You end up at the same result, or you consolidate your tax base. So the law still provides for 5 methods. There's really only one, option 3. That's what all districts do to get in compliance with recapture. So again, we will call it the purchase of attendance credits. It's basically purchasing ADA an amount necessary to reduce the excess local revenue. And I said this, we all do this one. So here's a picture of what recapture statewide, so across the state, And I guess 94 is when this came into place. I entered school finance in 1995. And so you can see this is the amount paid. So it hit 1 billion back here in 2004. Went up a little bit, not a lot of activity then. Woo! When everything went crazy, 2019, recapture also went crazy and went way up. And then in 2023, statewide, it was almost $5 billion. So what happened here after 2019, there was a change in law, and then right here, there was a change in law. And so that's why recapture went down. But we're still statewide right under $3 billion, sending back to the state. So that is really a revenue source for the state. They don't necessarily, I would love it if they would say, okay, this year we collected $4.5 billion. We're going to take all the ADA, divide it, and give every school district a check back. No, they don't do that. They say, oh, we have $4 billion that we can allocate to roads or health services or something else.
But some of that goes back to education. I mean, it's a huge problem that it's not required to stay in education, but
there's no
theory,
intentional action to say, oh, let's take this money from
Yes.
school districts and put it back
Right.
in education. So that would be great. This is our district's recapture history. So I came to the district in 2013 and we weren't paying recapture. And then I'll never forget the day I got our state property values and I went, this is worse than I projected. I was projecting, I don't know, 13,000 and it was gonna be 2 million. Okay, we got some budget issues. But what's interesting here, so we got up to 8 million and then House Bill 3 came along and then you can see it drops back. And then it starts creeping up again. We got up to 24 million in 22-23. Then Senate Bill 2 came along, changed it. So now we're trucking along about 8. At budget adoption, we're forecasting about 9 million. And now, because we have fewer students than we budgeted for, our recapture is right now at 11.6. The fun thing about this is you don't really know what this number is until at least a year until that year is done. And then the state settles up everything and will say, oh, by the way, you owe another X amount for last year for recapture, and you have to work that into your current budget. So today we're estimating about 11.6. Our high was 24 million. You know what I could do with $24 million?
We have to point, I don't want to get, but I was just going to say the difference between the district paying 24 million and 8 million was also that our tax revenue was different because House Bill 4 passed.
Well, this
not that the district's
law right
keeping that
here,
money.
what this did was raise the homestead exemption and lower our tax rate by another 10 cents. So that's why it went down, because our tax revenues went down. So if we have less money, then we pay less in recapture. And so that was all generated by state law. Thank you, Olivia, for that. And then I think Olivia might have asked for this chart a while back. So how does the recapture compare to the actual taxes collected? And so in green is the M&O tax collections for that year, and then in orange is the recapture payment. So see, our tax collections, gross tax collections had jumped up to 89 million. And so you take 24 out of that, we're at 65 million in net revenues. And so you can see when this green bar gets bigger, the orange bar gets bigger. And don't worry, we're going to get into all the details on this, so you're going to leave an expert. All right, this is a video that Texas School Coalition, I believe, put together. And it explains it really well. And so I want to play this. Switch, yay.
Of public education funding in Texas like a glass of water. The size of the glass is based on the amount of money that the state of Texas says each school district should have. School districts serving more students have a bigger glass. School districts serving fewer students may have a smaller glass. Student and district characteristics can also increase the size of the glass, and so does the district's tax effort. Local property tax revenue is like water flowing in. Some districts cannot fill their glass with local tax revenue, so the state provides the revenue to fill it up. Sometimes the water from local tax revenue spills over. This is known as recapture. The state comes in and soaks up all the water outside the glass. So how do we reduce recapture and stop so much water from overflowing? Well, you could pour less water, but that would mean a decline in property values, and that's not good for the economy. Reducing the tax rate can also mean less water flowing into the glass if the state reduces the tax rate. But if the local school district reduces the tax rate, that can shrink the glass, which means just as much water outside the glass subject to recapture, but less water in the glass to educate students. Or there is another way. Let's make a bigger glass. Let's make sure every school district's glass is full. If it's not filled with local property taxes, then the state should pour in the rest of the water. What we don't need is the water from our local property taxes spilling out of the glass and making a mess.
So that is a quick and dirty overview of recapture. And so think about the glass analogy, because I'm going to use that in some of my slides. I think it's the best way to illustrate when recapture comes into play. So let's understand tax rates first. So when you get your property tax bill, you probably zoom down to the bottom line, how much do I owe? But if you would really look at the detail, there are several taxing entities. We all have our own tax rate. But what you don't see for school districts is our tax rate has two pieces. So the first piece is dedicated to maintenance and operations. This is where we pay for everything it takes to run the school district, keeping the lights on, paying salaries, supplies, all of those operational type things. This is where recapture does apply. The other side of the tax rate is called interest and sinking. And that part of the tax rate can only be used to pay bonds, the principal and the interest, for bonds that voters approve. So the system is, we ask the voters to approve a bond election, we let them know what we think the tax impact of that is going to be, and then we set an INS tax rate sufficient to pay those debts. And so that part, interest and sinking, there is no recapture, and very restricted on how you can use these funds. So if you look at this as a picture, the operation, so it's a bigger bucket because our current tax rate is 75 cents, 75.52 cents. So that's what is generated, or that's what is taxed to generate funds to fund all of these things. The interest and sinking portion is 35 cents, and so that is what we use to pay interest payments on voter-approved bonds. So just think about it in two buckets. So no recapture over here, recapture over here. What we found in our last Taxpayer Tuesday was a lot of people don't even look at their bill, they just pay it or their mortgage pays it. So we want to take a step back and really talk about how your property taxes are calculated. So the first thing is the appraised market value as determined by the local appraisal district. So we are under Hayes Central Appraisal District, and they go and appraise all the properties within Hayes County. They determine what that property's market value is. Then you can get exemptions. These do not happen automatically. So think about the appraiser's office has no idea when you turn 65. They have no idea if you bought this property, if you're using it for rental property or if it's your homestead. So the property owner has to take action to get these exemptions. But what these exemptions do is reduce the value that the tax rate is going to be applied to. So when the state says, hey, we want to amend the Constitution to increase the homestead exemption, you go vote for that because that's going to increase your exemptions. So homestead exemptions at one point were 15,000, then they went to 25,000, and they went to 40,000, and today they're 100,000. So our state feels like that's the easiest way to pass on property tax relief is by increasing the homestead exemption, and they've focused on that a lot the last couple of sessions. So when you take the exemptions off your market value, that gives you net taxable value. This is the value that the tax rate is going to be applied to. You take that, you divide it by 100, and then you apply the tax rate. And so all governing boards set that tax rate in accordance with the laws for them. We usually do that in September. And so that tax rate times this taxable value divided by 100, that's what is on your property tax bill. So see, there's nowhere where we split it out between M and O, it's just that total tax rate, and that's what you're going to see. You have to go to our website or the tax office's website to see how that is split out. But that's going to be the total annual property taxes due. Another thing that we talk about a lot is a penny on the tax rate, and I did not realize that that's confusing. So what is a penny on the tax rate? So this 75.52 cents, if you think about it, is just a stack of 75 pennies and then a stack of 35 pennies to give us the total tax rate of $1.10. Well, for school funding purposes, these pennies have different characteristics because, as I said, I can't make this up. So we're going to get very clever. So 8 of our 75 pennies are called golden because they generate more. 5.83 of those 75 pennies are copper, and then the rest are just plain pennies. And then 35 cents of those are for INS purposes. They're just plain old pennies. They don't have special characteristics. So when we talk about a penny on the tax rate, we're really saying of that $1.10, what does this penny do? What does this penny do? What does this penny do? So the state defines those differently. And then, to make it even more complicated, we have Tier 1 and Tier 2. So Tier 1 pennies are what are called the compressed maximum tax rate, the MCR. So these are the pennies where recapture comes into play. So that 75.52 pennies, 60 something of them are just plain old Tier 1 MCR pennies. The state tells us what this rate is, and we cannot exceed it. So we have to tax at this MCR, and that is set by the state each year based on what they think the total state property value is going to do. If they think, if the comptroller thinks property values across the state are going to increase by 10%, then this MCR is going to go way down. If they think property values across the state are going to average 4%, then this compression, this rate won't decrease as much, like maybe a penny or two. When we get into Tier 2, this is where those golden and copper pennies come in. So golden pennies are called golden because there's no recapture. And if they don't generate the tax revenue that the state says you should get on those golden pennies, guess what? The state's going to give you the money to get there. The copper pennies, they have recapture. So if the state says these copper pennies on your taxable value should generate X, and you generate more, you don't get to keep that extra. But on these golden, if they generate more, you get to keep the extra. So there's no cap on the revenues generated by golden pennies. So when we look at recapture, we're talking about Tier 1 recapture on this MCR, and then Tier 2 recapture on these copper pennies. INS, plain old pennies, no recapture. They don't have any special characteristics. All right, so what determines recapture? We have funding formulas that are given to us via a spreadsheet that has 10,000 tabs at the bottom. I've never counted them. Probably 50 tabs, and the formulas will make you insane. So if you're ever trying to figure out where does this number come from, and it'll take you to this tab, and there's a formula there, and it'll take you to that tab, and there's a formula there. So these funding formulas are very, very complicated, and they're based on your students, your demographics, and your district character. So student counts. How many students do you have in attendance, not enrollment? How many actually come to school every day? How many of them are in a GT program? How many of them are in a bilingual program? How many of them are in special services? So we put all of that data in, And that gives us our tier 1 entitlement. That is going to determine how big is that glass that we're trying to fill. Then we measure the taxes that those MCR pennies, remember those tier 1 pennies? If we take that tax rate on our property values, oh, but here's the kicker, that's on the state property values, not on our local property values. Then the state says, okay, your taxes generated are measured against your entitlement that's based up here on your students. And then if you have more taxes, you pay recapture. If you have less taxes than this, then you're going to get state aid. So remember, property values are set by the local appraisal district, and they're reviewed by the state comptroller. And then this MCR is gauged against state values. And so now not only do we have to project what are our local values going to be, we have to project what are our state values going to be. So there's a lot of estimates in all of this. So again, recapture happens when local tax collections exceed the amount generated as necessary. Through all those formulas, the state says this is how much revenue you are entitled to keep, and then we're going to compare that to your tax collections. The size of the glass, so we're going to be looking at some glasses, that is going to be based on students and formulas. So if I have more students, what happens to the glass? It should get bigger, right? If I have fewer students, the glass is going to get bigger. If my tax collections stay the same and my glass gets smaller, recapture increases. And you saw that where we went from budgeted to where we're projecting now for this year. So level of tax collections is measured prior to any state aid contribution, and it only applies to M&O. So let's look at tier 1, level 1 recapture. You're going to see this chart again. So this is basically a picture of all of the characteristics of the district and a student that go into determining what is our tier 1 allotment. Our tier 1 allotment equals our tier 1 cost, our entitlement. This is basically how much revenue do we get to keep. So we look at career and tech, we look at early education, we look at transportation, what is our transportation cost? CCMR, that's college, career, military readiness. Are we a fast growth district? So fast growth, GT, school safety, and new instructional facilities, they all have an asterisk. That means that the allotment is capped. So we might be entitled to, I'm going to just make up a number, $1 million in fast growth, but the state doesn't have enough to give us $1 million based on all the fast growth districts in the state, so they're going to prorate that, and maybe we only get 800. And we find out this number, what, in the spring? Yeah. So we budgeted thinking we're fast growth, but we don't know what the state is going to cap, and so we might not get as much. So we take all of these characteristics of our students, of our district, run them through the formulas, bam, that's our number. What do you not see on here? Property taxes. So taxes are not considered at all when you come up with this allotment. And here's the kicker. Someone read this. How much? That number was set in 2019 and has not changed. Have we been through 3 legislative sessions? I think 3. We've been asking for this to increase, at least for 2 sessions, if not 3, because what happened since 2019? Double-digit inflation, right? Our kids are coming to us with bigger needs. And so we're still living off the same revenue number that was set in 2019. And so that's really what we're hoping for some relief from the state this session. I think they will probably do something on safety and maybe special education. But anything else is just going to be icing on the cake if we could get those 3.
And Elaine, isn't it true on the allotment we only get 6160 if the child comes to school every single day. So for every day they miss,
That number
we
goes
don't get
down.
6160.
Correct. So if you're a parent and you've seen a campaign about getting your kids to school, this is part of it. Number one, we want them in the classroom because that's where learning happens. And number two, it hurts us on our funding.
I always tell people, we have to educate for the seats in the chair, but we only get funding, like, rather or not that child is there
Right.
that day,
So-
we have to make sure that we have the classrooms available, the teachers available, so the expenses are there, but the funding is only there if the students is there.
Right. So we staff at the beginning of the year assuming all students will show up because there will be a day that all 25 kids in a 5th grade classroom are there, so I have to have 25 chairs. But most days might only have 23 or 24 because someone is absent. So that's the big kicker to all of this narrative is that we are still at 6160 and that hasn't been changed. And that's what drives how big this number down here is going to be. Okay, so imagine that this cylinder is a glass, just like from the video. This glass is this size because all of the formulas, our Tier 1 entitlement said, based on everything we know about your district, this is how big your glass is. This is how much revenue you need to fund your schools. You really need more, but that's what the state said. So now it's a question of who's going to fill the glass. So we have scenario 1. This is our Tier 1 entitlement. In scenario 1, our tax collections, that MCR tax rate times our property values is less than this entitlement. So our property value, our property taxes don't fill all the glass. So then what's going to happen is state aid is going to come in to fill the glass. So this is what that looks like. So remember, this whole cylinder is our revenue. This first little piece is available school fund. All school districts get that. It's a very small amount. Then we're going to pour in our tax collections. So remember, they were less than the size of our jar. So our tax collections filled our glass to here, and then the blue is what the state would come in. And so they're not going to fill over, right? They're just going to go to the very top of the glass. So this is a scenario for a school district that is not Chapter 49, that doesn't pay recapture. Scenario 2, here's our entitlement, it hasn't changed. Now, our tax collections exactly equal our entitlement. I am pretty sure this never ever happens, but with 1,000 students, maybe a couple. So in this case, you're not going to get state aid, but you're not going to pay recapture either. So our entitlement is the full size of the jar. We get the ASF. Our tax collections come to the very top of the class. They don't spill over. There's no room for state aid. So we don't need state aid, but we don't pay recapture. This would be the perfect scenario, right? But I don't think that exists very often. So then you have scenario 3. You still have the same size glass. Now your tax collections are more than your entitlement. So now what's going to happen is you're not going to get state aid because there's no room, but it's spilling over, so we're going to pay recapture. So here's that same cylinder. We have our Tier 1 entitlement. And now tax collections are this big, but our entitlement was only here. So this extra piece up here turns into recapture. We don't have any room for any of that blue, right? So you don't get any state aid, but you pay the state. So the state gets some aid. So is that all clear? That's as simple as it can. As simple as it can be. I didn't give you any spreadsheets, I didn't give you any numbers. Now let's get to the tricky part. That was Tier 1. Now we're going to go to Tier 2. Remember where these golden and copper pennies come in? This is Tier 2. So tier 2 recapture only happens on copper pennies. So let's see how that works. So we're going to look at this recapture. So our golden pennies are guaranteed to give us $1.2952 per WADA. That's a new term. I've been talking ADA, average daily attendance. WADA is weighted average daily attendance. So so ADA is just have 8,000 students, 75 of them were absent, so the ADA is the average daily attendance. Weighted ADA is, okay, some of those students were special ed, some of those students are GTs, they're all of those special populations. So WADA is naturally higher than ADA. And so in this calculation, it's great. I get to apply that 129 to my weighted ADA. Whew, we're in the heydays now. The board can approve up to 5 of these. And then it takes the voters to approve the next 3. So you might hear of a school district having a VATRE, a Vader, to go after these extra pennies because they're worth it. There's no recapture. I'm going to get 129 per WADA. This is awesome. The copper, man, they're only worth $49. Voters are required to approve these up to 9, and recapture applies. So if you see a district going after copper pennies, it means they really need them. When did voters in this district approve these? 2016, I believe it was. We did it's now called a Vader. Back then it was called a tax ratification election. We moved some pennies from the INS side, said we need them on the M&O side. And so we had all of these pennies. We had all 9, but as our tax rate has been compressed by the state, that's why we only have 5.83. We have all of these. So it's last in, first out. These go first, then these would go. And so that's what I always try to educate our board. If you want to take a penny off the tax rate, it's automatically coming after copper. You can't say, oh, well, I just want to take a tier 1 penny or I want to take a golden penny. It's going to be these first. So an illustration of the value of these pennies. So we have 2023, which is last fiscal year, and our current fiscal year. Here's our property value growth. So in 23-24, we had almost 11% property value growth. It went down. I've never, in my history with the district, seen property value growth this low. It's always been 8% or higher. So the economy is really making an impact on our property values. Here's our weighted ADA. So our enrollment today is, what are we at, 89? What is our enrollment today?
Oh, Lord, really?
What's our enrollment? I've seen so many numbers. We're in the 8,000s.
Yeah.
But look at my WADA. I'm in 10,000. So this is good. I'm getting paid for WADA, not ADA. Remember that guaranteed yield? It was $1.2621 back in the day. It increased to $1.2952. Like, yes, we need that. Still have 8. So our entitlement is 8 pennies times this times that. So the state formulas say I should get $10,424,000 last year. My taxes, those 8 pennies on property values, only generated $8.9 million. So guess what? Last year the state gave us $1.4 million to make sure we got this guaranteed yield. And this year they're giving us about the same, another 1.4. So this is why those golden pennies are so awesome. I don't pay recapture. The state gives me money for them. Now what if our tax values increased and I was generating $11 million this year? My entitlement's 10, and I'm generating 11. Where are my A students? No, we get to keep it. So I will die on this hill of golden pennies. You will not take my golden pennies away because I could generate 12 million. You get to keep it. Don't get rid of these golden pennies. Now the copper pennies, I'm not so passionate about. Okay, they're only worth $49. We have 5 and a change. They're in our entitlement, so the 5.83 times 49 times the WADA. Last year we were entitled to 2.9. Our tax, the 5 pennies generated 6.5. Wah, wah. Now what happens? I have to pay 3.5 back. So I pay in recapture on these copper pennies, and it hasn't changed much, another 3.5. So someone say, well, Elaine, just get rid of those copper pennies. I'm netting 2.8 million. I need to cut 2.5 million from my budget. Now, if I get rid of these, now I gotta cut another 2.8 million, so now we're looking at over 5 million in budget cuts. That's why I keep these copper pennies. So here's an illustration as well. So gross tax collections. So on our tier 1 MCR, that tier 1, those just plain Jane pennies, we generated 70 million. Excess above the recapture is 6 million, so we get to keep 64. The tier 2, those golden, remember we got 10.1, we get to keep it all. I want to back up, remember the 10.1, we got some of it, the state gave us some of it. So we get to keep all that 10. And then copper, we're keeping 2.8. So if I look at my budget of this 64 million, that's really covering classroom instruction. That's my teachers, that's facilities, keeping the facilities heated, cooled, maintained. So we're spending all of our tier 1 money just on basics. Our tier 2, that 10 million that we're getting, well, that's funding safety and security, transportation, campus leadership, so our principals, our school buses, our SROs and marshals, and then the 2.8 that we keep on copper, my fine arts and athletics budget is 3.6. So you see why those 2.8 are important. I don't have any room in the budget to really get rid of those. This is not to say that we budget every penny based on the penny. We look at the total revenues and the total budget. This was just to kind of justify the pennies on our tax rate. All right, so common misconceptions I get. My property values are increasing, the school district must be flush with cash. You must have so much revenue. Remember, our M&O revenues are determined by the tier 1 entitlement, that funnel, not tax collections. So how much do we get to keep based on the 6160 and the kind of students that we have? Remember this little chart that determines our allotment? Nowhere in this are tax collections considered when we're determining how much revenue we have. So that's that misconception. Number 2, we'll just lower the tax rate and you won't have to pay recapture. Well, don't you think that was a possibility? All recapture districts would just do that? So no, the state says, in law, Texas Education Code, the commissioner shall, that's pretty strong, reduce state aid or adjust the limit on local revenue if a school district is not compliant with this section. And what that means is if you're not taxing at that MCR, so you lower your tax rate to not pay recapture, guess what? The state's gonna go, oh no you don't. We're gonna lower your basic allotment so you don't get to keep as much, so you're gonna pay recapture. And that's this one, just lower the tax rate so you don't pay recapture. Golden and copper are enrichment, so could we get rid of gold and copper? Yes, doesn't impact your tier 1 recapture. But these pennies are keeping our budget alive. There's no recapture on those golden ones. We get state aid. We could reduce them, but that means we've got to cut more in operations. And Gina just went through a whole semester with a committee on where to make cuts in our budget. And how many cuts did they come up with?
Not a lot. They really want it focused on revenue increases and not wanting to reduce any programs or change the way we do business, education, or what we provide education.
And when you say increase revenues, we're talking user fees that aren't subject to recapture.
Local
things
revenues.
that we're in control of, like facility use fees and
Athletic ticket, a gate
pre-K
ticket.
tuition for those that aren't eligible, so all those things. All right, I'm gonna turn it over to Gina, I believe. So that is recapture in a nutshell and state aid. And then we have other restrictions on those revenues that come into us. And so she's going to talk about that, and hopefully I gave you, oh, I got 15 minutes.
I'm gonna fly through this. So I wanted to talk more about, and if we keep showing this chart, because it really is important, I'm gonna talk more about Tier 1 and kind of dig into what is in Tier 1, because we keep talking about the $6,160 for basic allotment. And so that's what I'm gonna focus on here, to kind of give you some resources. So this is truly a resource from TEA. You know, they put out what they call the Summary of Finance. And they put them out, there may be one or two even a month. They keep calculating, and once they get updated data that we submit based off of certain timelines throughout the year, then they update this information. Where it says LPE up there, that's a legislative planning estimate. So they use data that we submit to them for 2 years. So they may have data that they're using this year that was from 2 years ago that we put in based off of our demographer report and calculating and projecting special education, comp ed. They're using that to project what they think we're going to get for all school districts. And then the next column, it says NF. When you start out the school year, it says DPE, because it's the district planning estimate, so it's what we're planning, and it'll mimic LPE. As we move through the year and we feed them data and say this is actual, they'll get to near final. So at the end of the year, they'll be near final. This is near final for 23-24. And when it's done, which is more than a year after, you know, we close the year, it's at least 6 months to a year before that becomes final. They're still looking at stuff, they're still analyzing stuff, so it's really far out. But right now, at near final, this is very close to what we're monitoring internally. So we're doing our own estimates, especially at the beginning of the year, because we have the best data. TEA doesn't until we're turning in data. But you can go out to the TEA website and see these documents. You can go look up any district you want to for, it's called Summary of Finance, and you can pull these things down for past years as far back as the districts are open. But I'm just kind of proving out here. For 23-24, our ADA that year was 6,995 students. And if you take that and you multiply it by the 6,160, so these are just your regular students that came in attendance, that's where they're getting that $43 million. You multiply that and actually it plays out. So just kind of proving out how the methodology for all of this. So I had the board ask me back before the school year started, we keep talking about this basic allotment and that it's not increased since 2019. And it is a very important part of Tier 1 funding for school districts. So what would it look like if it increased? And so I did some incremental increases. I did $100, so I took the $61.60 and I bumped it to $62.60. So and this is all legislative, it's not something we can do, but in hopes that the legislature is going to do something, how would that impact this district? So doing that, bumping it up $100 would give us about $1 million, which sounds great, and we'd take anything we can get, absolutely. But it's really important to look at like a 1% increase here, just to give staff 1%, that's it, is $750,000. So it's great, but it's probably not going to get us or be able to, you know, give some 3 or 4% increases because we're not going to have the funding for it. So then I looked at, okay, what if we bumped it to $6,500? That's a $340 increase to the basic allotment. That would get us about almost $3.4 million. So again, addressing inflation, things that have increased, not just that we need to pay more, which we do. I mean, teachers need more, staff need more. In funding, it's expensive to live here. But we're also talking about supplies, contracted costs. Those things have all increased. That would definitely be super helpful to get this additional funding. And then what we're hearing through all of our resources like TASBO, Moat Casey, the regions, they really say that about 7,000, if they would increase that basic allotment to 7,000, that would kind of make up for the inflation increases that we've seen since 2019. And that would give us about $6 million. And that would be helpful to every district. And truly, that would be kind of bridging that inflation gap. We don't expect to see this, but I think the board wanted this kind of intentionality, like legislative action and looking at where do we need to be, where should we be? It's probably here. Do we think we're gonna get that? No, but it kind of gives you a good idea of what we're dealing with and all districts are dealing with whenever we've received no increase in the basic allotment. So I thought it was pretty interesting data. I wanted to share that. And now I want to look at funding for special populations and the spend requirements that are associated with that. So I keep going back to this chart because again, that's in the tier 1. So if you look at outside of the regular program, and Elaine mentioned it, we have comp ed, which is like your at-risk students who may need tutorials or there's a gap there. You have your CTE students, early education. I want to go through some of those and how they're funded so that you can kind of understand that. So again, this is that same document that's from TEA that's a near final. The funding for all of those special populations outside of the regular program is about $17.3 million. So your special education, your new your fast growth allotment, your transportation is all included in that funding right there. And I'm going to look at all of these funding programs have a spend requirement. So for gifted and talented, dyslexia, and early education, we receive additional funding for students and stuff that are coded to those programs. We have to spend 100% of those funds directly on those students. And it makes sense. I mean, you want to do that because they have needs. The next tiers are CTE, SPED, which is special education, your state comp ed, again, your at-risk students, bilingual, and CCMR, which is your college career ready. You have to spend 55% of any funding that you receive on those programs. And we're going to look at what we do in the district to kind of give you an idea of what that looks like. We all know safety and security. It doesn't have a spend requirement. There are legal requirements. We have to have an SRO in every campus. That was some legislation that came on, but we're not required to spend any certain amount. But we're going to look at that as well. Just
Hey, Gina, can I point out something? Go back.
Uh-huh.
So, Gina said generates additional funding. This is our total, this is that entitlement that we get to keep. And the confusion is, these are the tax revenues we get to keep, but then these are the areas where we have to spend them. So when we say we generate additional funding, it just means we are justifying those tax dollars. We're not getting more money from the state. It's just that total entitlement, whatever that dollar amount is. If it's 70 million, this is how you have to spend that 70 million. And so we're funding it through our tax collections, not through some other mechanism that the state is.
Right, it's just part of that bucket, that glass. I mean, this is the glass right here that we're talking about. So I wanted to look at dyslexia. So again, I went back to the same document, the summary of finance from TEA, and it says you're going to get, $607,376. That's how much we should have received last year, specific to dyslexia. And remember that dyslexia is 100% spend. So that funding has to be spent on those students 100%, and that means direct spend. So we have coding that is included in account codes and we submit. So it's your teachers, it's truly these hands-on, it's your aides, it's people, it's not, in the business office, there's obviously overhead costs for all of this. That's not included in this. You can't count that. It has to be directly related to those students, whether it's supplies, contracted services, or people, mostly people. So in this year, 23-24, there were 986 FTEs or dyslexia coded students. And dyslexia gets a weight of 0.1. That 0.1 gets applied to the 6160, which gives us $616. The 986, the FTEs times the 616 gives us the 607,376, just so that you can see how it ties out. Now here's what we spend. So if you look at 1920, our allotment was about $322,000. But we're spending $443, and those are direct spend costs, not looking at overhead or anything else. So we're spending, upwards of 189% of the allotment. We are having to contribute more to these programs because we're not, the weighted funding is not sufficient to cover the costs of what we need to provide. So here we got 571,000 or almost 572 in 24-25. That's what we're anticipating, but we're going to spend over $1 million. So just kind of give you an idea.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
When we submit to get that credit back or whatnot, is there any dialogue of how much did you actually spend? Like, do we submit total expenditures when we get that credit back? So is there any checks and
Yes,
balances?
they monitor this. So when we submit, like when I say compliance, these spend requirements, TEA is watching that and they're monitoring to make sure that we did spend at least 100% or at least 55%, whatever that requirement is, they're looking at, and if you don't, then districts get
I know that they're
penalized.
making sure you spend at least the minimum, but would they also potentially see that there's a trend that all districts are spending more, 180, 170, 190%?
They
more?
should be able to see that because we submit, it is by coding, they can definitely do that analysis, whether, I don't know how deeply they look into that until I think it comes with advocacy and things of that nature, like when you're not funding special education or you're not funding safety and security, then that's when the topics get brought up and they can absolutely go look at the data when they choose to. And they're looking at compliance, so at that point, yes, they're just making sure you met this and probably moving on until they're told to dig deeper. So, which is why putting this data together is really important so that we can feed that to boards and you can go to the legislature. I mean, this is why this analysis and this stuff is really important.
And so why are we spending $1 million so much more? It's just a cost of things.
It's cost, and most of this is dyslexia teachers, so it's teachers that are servicing dyslexia students, and that is, there may be some contracted services and there may be a few supplies, but probably 90% of that's going to be, probably more than that, to be honest.
More
It's going to be your
students,
dyslexia.
and more teachers
That's
you
correct.
need. Yeah.
That's correct. So I also wanted to I'm pulling up 3 different areas here. I wanted to talk about special education because this is, they're high need students, they're also high costs associated with that. For special education, there's a 55% requirement. And we also have something called MOE, and that's a federal spending requirement or mandate, where you have to spend as much the following year as you did the previous year on students, unless you can justify a reason not to. So you have to really closely monitor that you're not overextending yourself as a district. You want to meet the needs, obviously, but if you start increasing costs significantly, you're gonna have to maintain that increase and you can't just bring it back down. So you have to monitor all of this really closely. But for special education, and everybody is in this boat because special education is increasing everywhere. The needs, and you can see your students right here, right? 813 and 1920, and we're talking over 1,420. And this is at the beginning of the year. I suspect this is higher because usually we're adding students in there. They're doing ARGs and stuff at the beginning of the year, so this is probably a higher number at this point. But that's 17% over last year. So we're seeing a lot of growth in this area, and this is not just Dripping Springs. This is everywhere. But you can see the allotment, again, it's in green. So we're anticipating about 8.6, and you can look at the year that we actually finished, the 8.5. We've actually spent 12.9, so almost 13. We're spending over 150%. So we're definitely, we're meeting, well, we hope that we're meeting the needs. You always can have more here. There's lots of high need students that may need aids and things like that, and we're doing the best that we can, but we are spending, we're not spending just 55. We're spending 155% of that allotment. And the other big area is safety. So we've talked about this a lot too because there were some new requirements with the last legislative session, which is there's some really high costs associated with that. Not saying that it's not necessary, but it comes at a cost that we're not getting funded for. So we're required to have SROs at every single campus. And again, but there's no money for it. So the allotment is very low for safety and security. So we get about $200,000, and this is an increase. This is what they increased the last legislative session, so that's why you see that little bump there, because they started giving us about $15,000 per campus on top of the per student allotment they were giving us. But, we're getting $200,000, but we're spending close to $1 million. So again, we're talking huge, way over that 55%. Well, there's no spend requirement here. You can spend as much or as little as you want, but you gotta have an SRO and they don't come free. So just making sure. We'll do an assessment. Am I on time?
You're on time.
Okay. Got 1 minute. Trying to talk fast.
30 seconds.
So, what is the purchase of attendance credits? B1. Oh, Elaine, you didn't do a good job. They've forgotten.
One of the ways to reduce excess revenue.
That's correct.
There you go. Nicely done. Nicely said. You're gonna present this next time, right? Okay, so how can a district get out of recapture? One.
More students. There's
Yeah,
really no way.
There really is.
Change the law, more students.
And we are, I mean, I'm just gonna say this, we are in
Yes.
compliance. We watch this very closely because we definitely don't want to be paying back anything else. And you would pay penalties if you do not meet compliance, you will pay. You will pay money back to TA. And
Does that even go like with the resource officer, you know, the SROs, like if we didn't have them, do we get fined? Do we get?
they are doing checks, and I don't know if they find anyone yet because everybody's still trying to even get, you know.
There's not enough.
There's not
Right.
enough.
Yeah.
But they are, I know, with-
Safety audit
they're doing
checks.
safety audit checks.
The
and-
audits are
yeah.
very regular.
Yes. So they're definitely looking at it. I don't know that they find anyone yet because I think there's so many districts that I
I
don't
would
know.
say they're allowing for concessions, like if you're in
Right.
contact, if you're a very rural area, like a lot of the districts that have gone to like a true Marshall or Angel program, like they're allowing for contingencies. And they're
As long as
working
they're
well.
trying to fill it.
Yeah.
I think so as you're making efforts too, because there's also construction stuff that's required as well. And trying to get that, that's not gonna happen for some districts in a year or 6 months. You've got lots of things that you've got to do to meet those requirements, and it's gonna take some time just to get it done. Unless you were ahead of the game. So if tax collections increase but student ADA stays the same, does recapture increase or decrease? Recapture increase. Yeah, it would increase. So you all passed.
Barely.
See?
We get funding.
These get degrees.
So the next session is the legislative advocacy, which again, I mean, this kind of feeds into that. It's really important that everybody kind of understands where we're at and the costs of things associated with it. Thank you.